Harry Truman. Truman authorized the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, killing over 200,000 people, most of them civilians. While many in the U.S. viewed this as a necessary action to end World War II, others saw it as a disproportionate and inhumane use of force. The bombings decimated entire cities, leaving behind radioactive devastation that lingered for decades. The ethical debate continues to this day, with some historians suggesting Japan was already on the brink of surrender, making the use of atomic weapons unnecessary. Survivor accounts from Hiroshima and Nagasaki describe unspeakable suffering: burned flesh, radiation sickness, and the complete erasure of families and communities. International law was still developing at the time, but under modern standards, many argue this would qualify as a crime against humanity. Truman himself remained unapologetic, citing the desire to save American lives by avoiding a costly invasion of the Japanese mainland. Nonetheless, critics argue the choice targeted civilians deliberately and was intended as a show of strength, especially toward the Soviet Union in the early days of the Cold War. The long-term impact on survivors, known as hibakusha, and the subsequent nuclear arms race remains part of Truman's controversial legacy. His decision marked the first and only use of nuclear weapons in warfare, a precedent that has haunted global politics ever since. The bombings also set the tone for Cold War geopolitics, ushering in an age of nuclear brinkmanship and arms proliferation that defined international relations for decades. Richard Nixon. Nixon's expansion of the Vietnam War into neighboring countries led to widespread accusations of war crimes. Through Operation Menu and other covert campaigns, the U.S. dropped massive quantities of bombs on Cambodia and Laos, killing countless civilians. These bombings were conducted without congressional approval and were kept secret from the American public for years. Critics argue that Nixon's actions violated both U.S. and international law by attacking neutral countries and causing massive displacement and loss of life. In Cambodia alone, estimates suggest that over 500,000 people were killed or displaced, setting the stage for political destabilization and the rise of the Khmer Rouge. Villagers recount stories of sudden, unexplained explosions obliterating entire communities. The use of incendiary weapons, such as napalm and cluster bombs, added to the devastation. Nixon justified the bombings as necessary to disrupt Viet Cong supply lines, but observers say the tactic amounted to collective punishment. The lack of accountability and transparency has led many historians to classify these actions as war crimes. Moreover, the long-term consequences of the bombings still affect these regions, where unexploded ordnance continues to maim civilians decades later. Nixon's policy of Vietnamization, while aimed at reducing U.S. troop presence, also led to increased reliance on air power that often hit indiscriminate targets. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's presidency is heavily criticized for U.S. involvement in Latin American conflicts, where the U.S. supported regimes and paramilitary groups responsible for widespread atrocities. The Reagan administration funded the Contras in Nicaragua, a rebel group fighting the left-wing Sandinista government. Reports from the time detailed Contras committing acts of rape, torture, and the execution of civilians. In El Salvador and Guatemala, Reagan-backed governments were implicated in some of the worst human rights abuses of the era, including the El Mozote massacre, where over 800 villagers, mainly women and children, were slaughtered by U.S.-trained troops. Reagan defended these regimes as part of a broader Cold War strategy to curb the spread of communism, often dismissing or downplaying reports of abuse. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch consistently documented evidence of systematic violence by these groups. Critics argue that by providing military aid and training, Reagan became complicit in these crimes. Survivors of these massacres still carry the trauma, and memorials across Latin America bear witness to the devastation. Declassified documents later revealed that U.S. intelligence was aware of these atrocities, yet continued support. Bill Clinton. Clinton's foreign policy saw military intervention and sanctions that led to significant civilian harm, drawing allegations of war crimes. The United Nations sanctions imposed on Iraq throughout the 1990s with strong U.S. backing are estimated to have caused the deaths of over 500,000 children due to lack of medicine, clean water, and food. UNICEF and other humanitarian agencies highlighted the devastating effects of these sanctions, which many viewed as targeting the general population rather than the regime. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's infamous quote that "the price is worth it" became emblematic of the perceived callousness of U.S. policy. Later in Clinton's presidency, NATO's 1999 bombing campaign in Yugoslavia, launched without UN Security Council approval, further fueled accusations. Civilian targets, including TV stations, bridges, and passenger trains, were hit, resulting in significant casualties. The bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, claimed by the U.S. as a mistake, led to international outrage. Human Rights Watch reported that NATO's actions may have violated the laws of war by failing to distinguish between military and civilian targets. Clinton defended the campaign as a humanitarian mission to stop ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. However, critics argue that the methods used inflicted widespread avoidable suffering. The intervention set a precedent for bypassing international legal frameworks in favor of coalition-led military action. George Bush. George W. Bush's presidency is arguably the most heavily criticized in modern history for war crimes. Following the September 11th attacks, Bush launched the War on Terror, resulting in the invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. The latter, based on false claims of weapons of mass destruction, is widely viewed as an illegal war of aggression under international law. Civilian casualties from the Iraq War number in the hundreds of thousands, with countless more displaced. The U.S. military and intelligence agencies were implicated in the use of torture, including waterboarding, sleep deprivation, and sexual humiliation, at facilities like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. Photographs and leaked reports from these sites shocked the world and led to international condemnation. The CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques were authorized at the highest levels of government. Human Rights Watch, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the UN all characterized these practices as torture. Bush and other officials, including Vice President Dick Cheney and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, have faced calls for prosecution. Despite this, no formal legal proceedings have occurred, in part due to the U.S.'s rejection of the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction. Bush's legacy remains marred by the human cost of his policies and the erosion of legal norms. The global instability sparked by the Iraq invasion also contributed to the rise of extremist groups like ISIS. Barack Obama. While Obama campaigned on restoring America's moral leadership, his administration expanded drone warfare significantly, leading to allegations of war crimes. The U.S. conducted drone strikes in countries like Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, often without the consent of local governments. These strikes, intended to eliminate terrorist threats, frequently resulted in civilian deaths, including women and children. The use of signature strikes, where targets were chosen based on behavior patterns rather than confirmed identity, raised serious ethical and legal questions. One of the most controversial incidents was the killing of 16-year-old American citizen Abdulrahman al-Awlaki in Yemen, for which no official justification was ever provided. Investigations by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and other organizations documented hundreds of civilian casualties, often with little accountability or transparency. Obama implemented oversight reforms late in his presidency, but critics argue they were insufficient and too late. While Obama personally expressed discomfort with the power he wielded, he continued to rely on drone strikes as a key counter-terrorism tool. The normalization of extrajudicial killings through remote warfare has set a precedent that critics fear may be impossible to reverse. His administration's legacy is thus marked by a paradox of principled rhetoric and lethal policy. Joe Biden. Joe Biden entered office promising a more ethical foreign policy, but his administration has already faced serious allegations. In August 2021, during the chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, a drone strike intended to prevent a terrorist attack instead killed 10 civilians in Kabul, including 7 children. The Pentagon initially defended the strike before eventually admitting it was a mistake. Despite the acknowledgement, no U.S. personnel were held accountable, prompting outrage from human rights organizations. More recently, Biden has come under fire for his unwavering military and diplomatic support for Israel during the 2023-2024 Gaza conflict. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have accused both Israel and Hamas of war crimes, and some have argued that U.S. support could make Biden complicit. The U.S. has continued to provide arms and political cover despite mounting civilian casualties and alleged violations of international law. Critics argue that by enabling disproportionate attacks on civilian infrastructure, the Biden administration shares responsibility for the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. While no formal charges have been brought, the international community has increasingly scrutinized U.S. involvement. The Biden administration's actions raise ongoing questions about moral leadership and accountability on the global stage. Meanwhile, Biden's broader foreign policy decisions in regions like Yemen, where U.S. weapons continue to play a role in civilian harm, add further complexity to his human rights record. Donald Trump. Donald Trump's first administration maintained and expanded many of the counterterrorism practices of his predecessors, while making decisions that further alarmed human rights advocates. Trump loosened rules of engagement, resulting in increased civilian casualties from drone strikes and air raids. Especially in countries like Somalia and Syria, according to Air Wars, civilian deaths from U.S. operations surged during Trump's tenure, particularly in the battle for Mosul, where entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. One of the most controversial acts of his presidency was the pardoning of service members accused or convicted of war crimes, including Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher, who was found guilty of posing with the corpse of a teenage ISIS fighter. Military officials condemned the move, saying it undermined the rule of law and discipline within the armed forces. Trump also authorized the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani on Iraqi soil, an act some international legal experts labeled a violation of international law and Iraqi sovereignty. The lack of transparency in U.S. military operations expanded, with the Trump administration halting public reporting on drone strikes outside active war zones. Critics argue these policies normalized impunity and eroded long-standing ethical standards in warfare. Trump's rhetoric on foreign policy often emphasized brute force and deterrence over diplomacy or humanitarian concerns.